What if everything you thought you knew about God was wrong? What if the most sacred stories in human history were hiding a dark secret that could shatter your understanding of divine love? Today, we're diving into one of the most controversial books ever written about religion, a work so explosive that its own author said he lived in his deepest hell after writing it. If you're ready to have your worldview challenged, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe, because we're about to explore territory that most people are afraid to even think about. In 1952, a 76-year-old Carl Jung wrote something that would forever change how we understand God. He called it Answer to Job, and he wrote the entire thing in a single burst of energy while running a high fever. When he finished, something extraordinary happened. His fever broke, and he felt completely well again. Jung himself said it was like the spirit seizing one by the scruff of the neck. But here's what's truly shocking. Jung had been carrying this book inside him for 40 years. 40 years. He was terrified to write it because of what it revealed. You see, when Jung was just a child, 3 or 4 years old, he read the book of Job for the first time. And what he discovered there horrified him. He realized that Yahweh, the God of the Old Testament, wasn't the loving father figure everyone claimed he was. Jung saw something much darker. A God who could be manipulated by the devil, who would torture an innocent man just to win a bet. Think about that for a moment. The God you might pray to every night once allowed Satan to destroy a good man's life, killed his children, destroyed his wealth, covered his body with painful sores, all because the devil dared him to prove Job's loyalty. What kind of loving God does that? This is where Jung's journey into the shadow of the divine begins, and it's going to take us places that might make you deeply uncomfortable. But stay with me, because understanding this darkness might be the key to understanding yourself. Jung discovered something that theologians had been hiding for centuries. God isn't just love and light. God contains within himself both good and evil, creation and destruction, love and wrath. Jung called this the union of opposites, and he believed that recognizing this truth was essential for human psychological development. But here's the kicker: most people can't handle this truth. They want a sanitized version of divinity that makes them feel safe at night. But what happens when we refuse to see the whole picture? What happens when we split God into all good and project all the evil onto Satan? Jung believed this creates a dangerous psychological split that eventually leads to catastrophe. And looking at the world today, you might wonder if he was right. Let me tell you about Job himself, a man who faced the ultimate cosmic injustice. Job was righteous, blameless, everything a good person should be. And what did he get for it? Total devastation. His children died, his wealth vanished, his body was covered in painful sores, and even his friends abandoned him, telling him he must have done something wrong to deserve such punishment. But here's what makes Job extraordinary. He never gave up. Even when he couldn't understand why this was happening to him, even when God seemed absent or cruel, Job kept demanding answers. He said, "I know that my Redeemer lives," even in the depths of his suffering. Job somehow understood that within God himself, there had to be an advocate for justice, someone who would stand up for him against the very God who was allowing his torment. This is where Jung's insight becomes revolutionary. Job perceived that God was in conflict with himself. There was the God who demanded justice and the God who allowed injustice. There was the God of love and the God of wrath. And Job believed that eventually, the just side of God would have to answer for what the wrathful side had done. Drop a comment below if you've ever felt like Job, if you've ever wondered why bad things happen to good people, or if you've ever felt abandoned by the very forces you thought were supposed to protect you. You're not alone in this struggle, and understanding Jung's insights might help you make sense of your own dark nights of the soul. Jung realized that the book of Job was really about God's psychological development, not just human suffering. Through Job's ordeal, God was forced to confront his own shadow, the dark side of his nature that he had been unconscious of. And this confrontation changed everything. It set in motion a process that would eventually lead to one of the most radical events in human history: God becoming man. But here's where it gets really controversial. Jung argued that Christ's incarnation wasn't primarily about saving humanity from sin. Instead, it was God's attempt to make amends for what he did to Job. It was divine reparation, God saying, "I put an innocent man through hell, so now I'll experience what it's like to be human and suffer as humans do." When Christ cried out from the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" that was God experiencing what Job experienced. That was the moment when the divine finally understood human suffering from the inside. Jung called this the answer to Job. But the story doesn't end there. Jung believed that Christ's incarnation was just the beginning of a much larger process. He saw in the New Testament's book of Revelation hints of something even more radical coming: a second incarnation, not in a perfect, sinless being, but in ordinary, flawed humanity. This is where Jung's vision becomes almost too intense to comprehend. In Revelation, John sees a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon at her feet, giving birth to a child who will rule the nations with an iron rod. But this child isn't Christ returning, it's something new. It's the symbol of a divine birth that happens not in heaven, but in the psychological depths of human beings. It's the birth of what Jung called the self, the integrated personality that contains both light and shadow, good and evil, conscious and unconscious. This is why Jung's work is so threatening to traditional religion. He's saying that God's incarnation didn't end with Christ. It's an ongoing process, and it's happening inside you. Right now, as you listen to this, there's a divine drama playing out in your own psyche. The question is, are you conscious of it, or are you letting it happen unconsciously? If you're finding this perspective challenging or enlightening, hit that like button to let me know, and share this with someone who isn't afraid to grapple with big questions. These ideas need to be discussed, even if they make us uncomfortable. Jung believed that we're living in a critical moment in human history. We've developed the power to destroy ourselves: nuclear weapons, environmental destruction, artificial intelligence that could surpass human control. We have godlike power, but we still have the consciousness of children playing with fire. The only thing that can save us is developing a more mature, integrated understanding of ourselves and the divine forces working through us. But this integration comes at a cost. Jung discovered that to become whole, we have to embrace our shadow, the parts of ourselves we'd rather deny. We have to acknowledge that we're capable of both great good and great evil. We have to accept that the same psychological forces that create saints also create monsters. This is terrifying for most people, which is why they prefer simplified, sanitized versions of spirituality. The book of Revelation describes the end times as a period of great tribulation, when evil seems to triumph before the final victory of good. Jung read this not as a literal prophecy, but as a psychological map of the consciousness development process. Before integration can happen, there has to be a violent collision between conscious and unconscious, between the persona we present to the world and the shadow we hide from ourselves. Look around at the world today. Do you see signs of this collision? Political polarization where each side projects pure evil onto the other. Religious extremism that claims God only for one group while damning everyone else. Environmental destruction driven by unconscious greed and short-term thinking. Jung would say these are symptoms of a species going through a collective psychological crisis, the birth pains of a new level of consciousness. But here's the hope hidden in Jung's dark vision. This crisis is necessary. Just as a butterfly has to dissolve in the cocoon before it can emerge transformed, Humanity has to go through this period of dissolution before it can emerge more conscious, more integrated, more capable of handling the godlike powers it has developed. Jung saw evidence of this transformation beginning in his own time. In 1950, Pope Pius XII declared the Assumption of Mary, the belief that Mary was taken up into heaven body and soul. For Jung, this wasn't just a Catholic doctrine. It was a symbol of the feminine principle being integrated into the Godhead. The Trinity becomes a quaternity. The masculine, sky god energy of traditional religion gets balanced by the feminine, earth-based wisdom that has been suppressed for centuries. This matters because the feminine principle in psychology represents receptivity, intuition, the ability to hold paradox without needing to resolve it immediately. These are exactly the qualities we need to navigate the complexity of modern life. The old patriarchal model of religion, where God is pure good, Satan is pure evil, and humans are supposed to choose one side, no longer works in a world where we've discovered the unconscious, where we understand trauma and projection, where we can see how good intentions often lead to destructive outcomes. Comment below if you've experienced this shift in your own spiritual journey, if you've moved from black and white thinking to a more nuanced understanding of good and evil, or if you've had to integrate aspects of yourself you once rejected. The process Jung describes isn't easy. He called it individuation, and he compared it to the alchemical process of creating the philosopher's stone. The alchemists believed they could transform base metals into gold through a series of chemical processes that involved repeated dissolution and reconstitution. Jung realized they were really describing a psychological process, the transformation of unconscious, reactive behavior into conscious, integrated action. This process requires what Jung called holding the tension of opposites. Instead of immediately choosing sides when we encounter conflict, whether in politics, relationships, or our own internal contradictions, we have to learn to sit with the discomfort of not knowing, of seeing validity on both sides, of recognizing that the truth often lies in paradox rather than simple answers. This is incredibly difficult for most people. Our brains are wired to categorize quickly, to decide what's safe and what's threatening, to align with our tribe and reject the other. But Jung believed that this primitive psychological functioning is what keeps us trapped in cycles of projection and conflict. To break these cycles, we have to develop a more sophisticated consciousness, one that can hold contradiction without needing to resolve it immediately. The Book of Revelation describes a new Jerusalem coming down from heaven after all the old structures have been destroyed. Jung saw this as a symbol of the integrated personality, a psychological state where all the scattered parts of the self are unified under the guidance of what he called the self with a capital S. This isn't the ego, which is just the conscious tip of the iceberg. The self is the total personality, including conscious and unconscious, individual and collective, human and divine elements. But reaching this state requires going through what Jung called the dark night of the soul. You have to face everything you've been running from, your capacity for selfishness, your unconscious prejudices, your shadow projections, your secret fears and desires. You have to acknowledge that the enemy you see out there is often a reflection of something you refuse to see in yourself. This is why Jung said he lived in his deepest hell after writing Answer to Job. He had to confront the full reality of human and divine darkness, but he also said that from hell, he couldn't fall any further. There was nowhere to go but up. Sometimes we have to descend into our own psychological underworld before we can emerge transformed. Share this video with someone who might be going through their own dark night of the soul. Sometimes just knowing that there's a larger pattern to our suffering can make it bearable. Jung believed that we're now living in the transition between the age of Pisces, the Christian era, symbolized by the fish, and the age of Aquarius, symbolized by the water-bearer who pours out the waters of consciousness. The Piscean age was characterized by the splitting of opposites, good versus evil, spirit versus matter, heaven versus earth, church versus world. The Aquarian age will be characterized by the integration of opposites, not by eliminating conflict, but by finding ways to hold paradox creatively. This shift is already happening around us. In psychology, we're moving from models that pathologize difficult emotions to models that see them as information. In spirituality, more people are embracing practices that honor both light and shadow. In science, quantum physics has shown us a universe where seemingly contradictory things can be simultaneously true. In social movements, there's growing recognition that complex problems require nuanced solutions that go beyond simple us versus them thinking. But this transition is messy and dangerous. Old structures are breaking down before new ones are fully established. People are caught between worldviews, too sophisticated to believe in simple religious answers, but not yet equipped with the psychological tools to handle radical uncertainty. This is why we're seeing so much mental health crisis, so much polarization, so much escapism into fantasy and addiction. Jung's message is both sobering and hopeful. This crisis is necessary, but it's not guaranteed to have a positive outcome. Everything depends on whether enough individuals can do the inner work of integration to serve as bridges between the old world and the new. The collective consciousness can only rise to the extent that individuals are willing to take responsibility for their own psychological development. This is where you come in. You're not just a passive observer of this historical transition, you're an active participant. Every time you choose consciousness over unconsciousness, every time you own your shadow instead of projecting it, every time you hold paradox instead of collapsing into simplistic thinking, you're contributing to the collective evolution of human consciousness. But Jung was realistic about how difficult this work is. He knew that most people, most of the time, are driven by unconscious forces they don't understand. He knew that even the most conscious individuals have moments of reactivity, projection, and unconscious behavior. The goal isn't perfection, it's increasing awareness. Jung was particularly interested in dreams as messages from the unconscious about this integration process. He found that people going through individuation often dream of symbols that represent the union of opposites, hermaphroditic figures, sacred marriages, divine children, mandala-like images that suggest wholeness and completion. If you've been having vivid, symbolic dreams lately, pay attention. They might be your psyche's way of guiding you through your own integration process. Comment below about any dreams or synchronicities that seem connected to themes of integration, shadow work, or spiritual transformation. The alchemical tradition that fascinated Jung described the creation of the philosopher's stone as the result of a sacred marriage between masculine and feminine principles, solar and lunar energies, conscious and unconscious contents. This wasn't just abstract symbolism, it was a practical description of psychological development. The masculine principle in this context represents focused consciousness, logical thinking, the ability to discriminate and make decisions. The feminine principle represents receptive consciousness, intuitive knowing, the ability to see connections and patterns. Most people are overdeveloped in one direction and underdeveloped in the other. Integration requires developing both modes and learning to move fluidly between them as situations require. Modern life tends to overemphasize masculine consciousness. We're constantly in doing mode, analyzing, planning, competing, achieving. But Jung realized that without balancing this with feminine consciousness, being mode, feeling, intuiting, receiving, we become rigid, driven, disconnected from our own inner wisdom and from the natural rhythms that could guide us. The Book of Revelation's vision of the woman clothed with the sun represents this rebalancing on a collective level. The suppressed feminine wisdom is returning to consciousness, not to replace masculine energy, but to marry it, creating a more complete and sustainable form of consciousness. You can see this happening in the growing interest in mindfulness, in the return of goddess spirituality, in the environmental movement's emphasis on interconnection rather than domination, in the development of emotional intelligence alongside analytical intelligence. These aren't just cultural trends, they're symptoms of a deeper psychological shift. But Jung warned that this integration process would also trigger a powerful counter-reaction from forces that benefit from keeping consciousness split and projected. He saw in Revelation's description of the Antichrist a warning about what happens when the shadow side of transformation asserts itself. The Antichrist, in Jung's interpretation, isn't a literal future world leader. It's a psychological principle, the inflation that can happen when someone has a genuine spiritual experience, but lacks the humility and integration to handle it wisely. When people feel they've discovered the truth about reality, they often become convinced that they're above ordinary moral considerations. They justify increasingly destructive behavior in the name of higher consciousness or divine mission. We see this pattern throughout history in spiritual movements that start with genuine insights, but gradually become authoritarian and abusive. We see it in political movements that begin with legitimate grievances, but end up dehumanizing their opponents. We see it in individuals who have genuine awakening experiences, but then develop messianic complexes that isolate them from feedback and accountability. This is why Jung emphasized that psychological development has to include what he called moral consciousness, not adherence to external rules, but the development of an internal sense of responsibility for the consequences of our actions. Consciousness without conscience becomes dangerous. Spiritual power without psychological integration becomes corrupt. The key insight from Jung's interpretation of Revelation is that the final battle isn't between good and evil as external forces. It's between conscious and unconscious ways of holding the tensions that exist within every individual and every collective. The question isn't whether you'll experience conflict, but whether you'll meet that conflict consciously or unconsciously. Meeting conflict consciously means recognizing your own contribution to whatever problems you're facing, owning your projections, seeing the partial validity in opposing viewpoints, and looking for creative solutions that honor everyone's legitimate needs. Meeting conflict unconsciously means assuming you're completely right and others are completely wrong, projecting your own shadow onto opponents, and seeking to destroy rather than understand. Jung believed that individuals who can consistently choose the conscious approach serve as bridges between opposing forces. They become what he called wounded healers, people who have integrated enough of their own darkness to help others navigate theirs. These individuals don't claim to have all the answers, but they've developed the psychological skills to sit with difficult questions without needing to resolve them prematurely. If you're interested in developing these skills yourself, start by paying attention to your own projection patterns. When you feel strong emotional reactions to other people's behavior, ask yourself, what aspect of myself might I be seeing reflected in them? This doesn't mean everything is projection. Sometimes people really are behaving badly, but it means cleaning up your own side of the street before trying to fix others. Jung also recommended what he called active imagination, engaging consciously with the symbolic images that arise from your unconscious through dreams, fantasies, creative expression, and meditation. Instead of either dismissing these images as meaningless or taking them literally, you learn to dialogue with them, to ask what they might be trying to communicate about your psychological development. The goal isn't to eliminate conflict or achieve some state of permanent bliss. Jung was deeply suspicious of spiritual paths that promise to eliminate suffering or conflict permanently. He believed that life is inherently polarized, We experience meaning through contrast, growth through challenge, love through loss. The goal is to develop the psychological capacity to engage with these polarities creatively rather than reactively. This brings us back to the central insight of Answer to Job. God himself is not beyond conflict, but is the very source and container of all conflict. The divine isn't found by transcending human limitations, but by going more deeply into them, accepting them, and finding ways to work with them skillfully. Jung once said that the privilege of a lifetime is being who you are, but most people spend their lives trying to be someone else, someone more acceptable, more successful, more spiritual, more enlightened. Jung discovered that psychological health comes from accepting and integrating who you actually are, including the parts of yourself you'd rather change. This doesn't mean giving up on growth or becoming passive about your development. It means learning to work with your actual raw material rather than trying to manufacture a perfect persona. It means finding ways to express your unique combination of strengths and shadows in service of something larger than your personal comfort. The book of Revelation ends with the vision of a new heaven and new earth, where death and suffering are eliminated, and God dwells directly with humanity. Jung interpreted this not as a literal future event, but as a symbol of the psychological state that becomes possible when someone has fully integrated their personality. The New Jerusalem is the integrated psyche, where all the various parts of the self are unified under the guidance of the transcendent function. But Jung also warned that reaching this state isn't the end of the story. Like any achievement in life, psychological integration has to be maintained through ongoing practice. The unconscious continues producing new material that needs to be integrated. The collective shadow continues seeking new targets for projection. The tension between various aspects of the self never fully resolves, it just becomes more workable. This is why Jung was suspicious of spiritual traditions that promised final liberation or complete enlightenment. He believed that consciousness is an ongoing process, not a destination. The goal is not to solve the mystery of existence, but to develop a more skillful relationship with mystery itself. As we face the challenges of the 21st century, climate change, technological disruption, political polarization, social inequality, Jung's insights about the integration of opposites become increasingly relevant. These problems are too complex to be solved through simple either or thinking. They require the kind of both and consciousness that can hold multiple perspectives simultaneously and find creative syntheses. They also require individuals who have done enough inner work to avoid projecting their own unresolved conflicts onto external situations. When we can own our own capacity for destruction, we become more effective at addressing collective destructiveness. When we can accept our own limitations, we become more skillful at working with collective limitations. Jung's vision of the continuing incarnation suggests that each of us has the potential to serve as a bridge between heaven and earth, between conscious and unconscious, between individual development and collective evolution. But this potential can only be realized through the patient work of integration, learning to hold our own contradictions with compassion, developing the capacity to sit with difficult emotions without being overwhelmed by them, and finding ways to express our unique gifts in service of the larger whole. The book of Revelation describes the tree of life in the New Jerusalem as bearing 12 kinds of fruit and leaves for the healing of the nations. Jung saw this as a symbol of the integrated individual whose very presence becomes healing for the collective. Not through preaching or teaching, but through embodying a more integrated way of being that gives others permission to embrace their own wholeness. This is work that anyone can begin, regardless of their religious background or spiritual beliefs. It starts with honest self-examination, continues through the gradual acceptance of what you discover about yourself, and develops through the ongoing practice of choosing consciousness over unconsciousness in your daily interactions. Jung's answer to Job ultimately suggests that the biblical story of the righteous sufferer who refuses to abandon his faith despite cosmic injustice is really our story, humanity's story. We live in a universe that often seems arbitrary and cruel, where bad things happen to good people for no discernible reason. But like Job, we have the capacity to demand answers, to insist on meaning, to refuse to be defeated by circumstances beyond our control. And like Job, we may discover that our willingness to wrestle with the divine, rather than simply submitting to it, actually advances the process of consciousness evolution. Our questions force deeper answers. Our refusal to accept simplistic explanations pushes toward more sophisticated understanding. Our demand for justice creates the psychological pressure that eventually brings justice into manifestation. The answer to Job that Jung discovered is that there is no final answer, only an ongoing process of consciousness development that requires our active participation. We are not victims of cosmic forces beyond our control, but co-creators in the ongoing evolution of consciousness itself. This is both a tremendous responsibility and an extraordinary privilege. The question that remains is whether you're ready to accept this responsibility and claim this privilege. Are you willing to dive into your own psychological depths, to confront your own capacity for both creation and destruction, to develop the skills needed to hold paradox creatively rather than react to it unconsciously? Jung's work suggests that everything depends on individuals who are willing to undertake this journey. The collective consciousness can only evolve to the extent that individuals are willing to do their own inner work. The new age of integrated awareness can only emerge through people who embody that integration in their own lives. This isn't about becoming perfect or achieving some exalted spiritual state. It's about becoming more fully human, more conscious of your motivations, more accepting of your limitations, more skilled at navigating the inevitable conflicts that arise from being finite beings with infinite longings. Jung once wrote that the privilege of a lifetime is being who you are. In the context of Answer to Job, this becomes even more profound. The privilege of a lifetime is becoming who you are in service of the ongoing incarnation of consciousness itself. You are not just living your own individual life. You are participating in the cosmic process by which the divine becomes increasingly conscious of itself through human awareness. This perspective transforms everything. Your personal struggles become part of a larger sacred drama. Your psychological development becomes a contribution to collective evolution. Your willingness to face your own darkness becomes a gift to the larger process of bringing unconscious contents into the light of awareness. The work is difficult, the outcome uncertain, but the alternative, remaining unconscious while wielding the power of gods, is too dangerous to contemplate. As Jung put it, everything now depends on whether man can develop a higher level of consciousness. And that development begins with individuals like you, who are willing to take responsibility for their own psychological integration. The journey into the shadow of the divine that Jung mapped in Answer to Job ultimately leads not to despair, but to a more mature hope. Hope based on understanding rather than wishful thinking. Hope that includes rather than denies difficulty. Hope that emerges from the willingness to participate consciously in the ongoing creation of meaning, rather than waiting passively for meaning to be provided by external authorities. This is the great work of our time. This is your invitation to participate in the most important project in human history, the evolution of consciousness itself. The question is not whether you're qualified for this work. You became qualified the moment you became human. The question is whether you're willing.